Sometimes the coldest nights bring the warmest grace. When you've lost everything, a stranger's kindness can feel like a miracle. High in the Montana mountains, cowboy Eli Thatcher expects to weather a winter blizzard alone in his remote cabin. Then comes a knock at his door, an elderly native woman and her two young granddaughters, freezing and desperate, driven from their ancestral home with nowhere left to turn. Eli is a man who's kept the world at arm's length for years, haunted by his past. But when the grandmother speaks those words, "We have nowhere to go," something shifts. What happens when a man who's lost everything opens his door to those who've had everything taken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been building since noon, and by 3 o'clock, Eli Thatcher knew he was in for a rough one. Not that it bothered him much. He'd weathered plenty of Montana blizzards in his 56 years, and this cabin had stood firm through worse. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching on the layer of ice already forming over yesterday's snow. The sky hung low and grey, pressing down on the mountains like a heavy wool blanket. Eli squinted toward the tree line, where the pines bent and swayed, their branches beginning that particular dance they did before a big storm. He'd learned to read these signs, the way some men read newspapers, the angle of the wind, the quality of the cold, the way sound carried differently when serious weather was coming. He made his way to the woodshed, his breath forming white clouds that the wind tore away before they could fully form. The shed was well stocked, he'd seen to that back in October, but he wanted enough split wood on the porch to last 3 days without having to venture out. A man could get disoriented in a whiteout between the cabin and the shed, even when they were only 30 feet apart. He'd heard stories of men found frozen just yards from their doors, turned around in the swirling white. Eli worked steadily, carrying armload after armload of split pine and oak, stacking it neatly against the cabin wall under the overhang where it would stay dry. His muscles remembered the rhythm of this work, the same rhythm they'd known for decades. Ranch work, fence mending, hay baling, it all came back to the same basic truth. Steady effort, no wasted motion, get the job done before the weather turned. Inside, the cabin was small but orderly. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A wood stove squatted in the corner, its iron sides still warm from the morning fire. The walls were bare logs, chinked tight against the wind, and the floor was made of wide pine planks that had darkened with age and wear. A small bedroom opened off the back, just large enough for a bed and a dresser. The bathroom was an even smaller addition, plumbed when Eli had installed a cistern system 5 years back. Everything in the cabin had its place. Eli's life had narrowed to routines, and he found comfort in that narrowing. Coffee at dawn, check the weather, tend to whatever needed tending, simple meals, read in the evening by lamplight, sleep, repeat. It wasn't much of a life. He knew that, but it was predictable. Predictable meant safe. Safe meant he couldn't hurt anyone, and no one could hurt him. On the mantel above the stove sat the only decoration in the cabin, a worn leather Bible, its cover cracked and faded, the gold lettering nearly rubbed away. It had belonged to his mother, passed down to her from her mother before that. Eli hadn't opened it in 20 years, not since the funeral. 2 funerals, really, on the same grey afternoon. His wife Sarah and their baby daughter, both taken in a labor that went wrong, that went so terribly wrong that even now the memory of it could steal his breath. He looked at the Bible now as he built up the fire, adding split logs one at a time. His mother would have known what to do with grief like his. She'd had faith enough to move mountains, or so it had seemed to him as a boy. She'd talk to God like he was sitting right there at the kitchen table, telling him about her worries and her hopes, thanking him for blessings and asking him for strength. After she passed, that was 10 years ago now, Eli had tried to keep up that conversation. but his words felt like they hit the ceiling and fell back down. Eventually, he stopped trying. The Bible stayed on the mantel, though. He couldn't bring himself to put it away. It sat there like a quiet witness to something he'd lost, but couldn't quite name. Faith, maybe, or hope, or just the simple belief that the world made some kind of sense. By 4 o'clock, the snow had started. Big flakes at first, drifting down almost lazy-like, catching the last of the afternoon light. Eli checked his supplies one more time: canned goods, dried beans, flour, coffee, oil for the lamps. He had enough to last a month if he needed to. Not that he would. Even the worst storms blew themselves out in a week or less. He filled the cistern reservoir, made sure the stove was drawing properly, and hung his coat on the peg by the door. The cabin was warm now, almost too warm, and he cracked a window an inch to let in some fresh air. The wind was picking up, making that low moan in the eaves that sounded almost human if you let yourself think about it too much. Eli made himself an early supper: fried potatoes and onions, a piece of venison from the buck he'd taken in November, coffee so strong it could strip paint. He ate at the small table, looking out the window at the snow that was falling harder now, the flakes smaller and more determined. The world was disappearing into white. This was the part of winter he'd come to appreciate, if not exactly love: the forced stillness. The way the snow muffled everything, creating a silence so complete it felt almost like a presence. Out here, in this storm, he was truly alone. No decisions to make beyond the practical ones. No people to disappoint or be disappointed by. Just him and the mountain and the weather, all locked together in a temporary truce. He washed his dishes: 3 plates, a fork, a knife, a coffee cup, and set them to dry. The routine of it steadied him, everything in its place, everything clean and ordered. Control, that's what it was about. He couldn't control much in this world, but he could control this small space, these simple tasks. Dark came early, the way it did in December, and with it the storm found its full voice. The wind wasn't moaning now, it was howling, driving the snow horizontal, rattling the windows in their frames. Eli lit 2 oil lamps and settled into his chair by the stove with a book he'd read 3 times already. It didn't matter that he knew the story, the familiar. Words were like a path through known territory. No surprises, no sudden turns. But he found himself reading the same paragraph over and over, not taking in the words. His mind kept drifting to the storm outside, to the sound of the wind, to the feeling he sometimes got on nights like this, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. 20 years he'd been alone. 20 years since he'd held Sarah's hand and watched the light go out of her eyes. 20 years since he'd made himself a promise: never again. Never put himself in a position to lose like that again. Never let anyone close enough to hurt him when they left. It was easier this way. Safer. He told himself that on the nights when the silence got too heavy, when he'd go days without hearing his own voice, except to talk to himself while doing chores. He'd made his choice, and he'd stuck with it, which was more than a lot of men could say. The Bible watched him from the mantel. He could feel it there, the weight of all those words his mother had believed in. Love thy neighbor, do unto others, bear one another's burdens. Fine sentiments, but they required a kind of courage he no longer possessed. Better to keep to himself. Better to need nothing and no one. The storm intensified as the evening wore on. By 9 o'clock, it sounded like the mountain itself was trying to tear the cabin apart. The wind screamed and the snow piled up against the windows, cutting off what little light came from the lamps. Eli checked the stove one more time, added another log, and decided to turn in early. There wasn't much else to do, and tomorrow he'd need to dig out the porch if the snow kept up like this. He was in the bedroom, pulling off his boots, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A sound that made him go still, one boot in his hand, listening hard. There it was again, a knocking, faint but distinct. Someone was at his door. Eli's first thought was that he'd imagined it. Who would be out in this weather? The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain, and anyone with sense was hunkered down by now. But the knocking came again, more insistent this time, and with it a sound that might have been a voice, lost in the wind. He pulled his boot back on and went to the main room. The knocking continued, steady now, urgent. His hand went to the door handle, and he paused. Every instinct told him not to open it. Opening that door meant letting in more than just the cold. It meant responsibility. It meant risk. It meant breaking the careful isolation he'd built around himself like armor. But the knocking didn't stop, and underneath it he could hear something else now, a voice, definitely a voice, calling out words he couldn't quite make out. Eli Thatcher stood with his hand on the door handle, the Bible silent on the mantel behind him, the storm raging all around. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned the handle and pulled the door open. The wind hit him like a fist, driving snow into his face, stealing his breath. He squinted into the white chaos and saw them, 3 figures huddled on his porch, barely visible in the swirling dark. An old woman in front, and behind her 2 small shapes that had to be children. The woman raised her head, and in the lamplight spilling from the cabin, Eli saw her face, weathered and brown, lined with years and hardship, but dignified. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something. He recognized the look of someone who had run out of options. "Please," she said, and her voice was steady despite the cold that must have been cutting through her. "We have nowhere to go." For a heartbeat, Eli stood frozen, every argument against this moment lining up in his mind like soldiers. He didn't know these people. He wasn't equipped to take care of anyone. He'd chosen this life specifically to avoid situations exactly like this one. But the woman's eyes held his, and behind her the 2 children shivered in the wind, and something in him, something he'd thought he'd buried 20 years ago, wouldn't let him close that door. "Get inside," he said, stepping back. Quickly now, they came in like ghosts, so quiet and careful he might not have known they'd entered, except for the snow they brought with them. The woman first, then the 2 girls, all 3 of them wrapped in blankets that were far too thin for weather like this. Eli shut the door hard against the wind and turned to face them. Up close, in the lamplight, he could see just how bad their situation was. The woman was old 70 or more, he'd guess, with long grey hair in a braid that hung over her shoulder. Her face was native, high cheekbones and dark eyes that took in everything but revealed little. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt under the blanket, both soaked through. The children, girls, maybe 6 and 8 years old, clung to her sides, their small faces pinched with cold, their lips tinged blue. "You'll need dry clothes," Eli said, and his voice came out gruffer than he'd intended. "And heat. Come over by the stove." They moved where he directed them, the old woman keeping the children close. Eli went to his bedroom and pulled out what he had, a couple of his own flannel shirts, some wool socks, a sweater his mother had knit that he'd never had the heart to get rid of. It would all be too big, but it would be dry and warm. He brought the clothes out and handed them to the woman. "There's a bedroom through there," he said, pointing. "You can change. I'll make some coffee, or tea, if you'd rather." "Coffee would be good," the woman said. Her voice was low and measured, each word chosen carefully. "Thank you." She herded the girls into the bedroom and closed the door. Eli stood in the middle of his cabin, listening to the muffled sounds of them changing clothes, and wondered what in God's name he'd just done. 3 people, 3 strangers, in his house. Everything he'd built his life around was crashing down, and it had taken less than a minute. He busied himself making coffee, filling his 2 good cups and a tin mug he used for camping. His hands were steady, ranch work had taught him to stay calm in a crisis, but his mind was racing. Where had they come from? What were they doing out in a blizzard? And what was he supposed to do with them now? The bedroom door opened and they emerged, transformed. The girls were swimming in his flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, the tails hanging to their knees. The woman had put on the sweater, and it hung loose on her thin frame, but already Eli could see some color returning to their faces. The older girl had dark hair in 2 braids, serious eyes that reminded him of a spooked colt. The younger one had shorter hair and looked like she might cry if anyone spoke too loud. "Sit," Eli said, gesturing to the chairs at his table. "Get that coffee in you." The woman sat and wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. The girls pressed close to her sides, watching Eli with wary eyes. He stood by the stove, not sure where to put himself in his own cabin now that it was full of people. "I'm Mary," the woman said after a long silence. "Mary Blackfeather. These are my granddaughters, Sage and Willow." Eli nodded. "Eli Thatcher. You're lucky you found this place. Another hour in that storm." And he didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what another hour would have meant. "We didn't find it by luck," Mary said. "We saw your smoke this afternoon, before the storm got bad. We were trying to reach the old winter shelter, the one my grandmother used, and her mother before that. But when we got there," she paused, and something hard flashed in her eyes. "It was gone, torn down. In its place, survey stakes and orange tape, everything marked up like a piece of meat at the butcher's." She reached into the front of the sweater and come out a folded piece of paper, spreading it on the table. Eli leaned in to look. It was a map, hand-drawn on the back of some kind of form letter, showing the terrain around his cabin. But what caught his attention were the marks on it, sections outlined in red, labeled with dates and notations: developer claims, purchase agreements, mineral rights assessments. "This is all ancestral land," Mary said, her finger tracing the boundaries. "Not according to white man's law, maybe, but according to the law that matters, the law of who lived here, who survived here, who died here. My people have used that winter shelter for generations. It's protected from the wind, near water, perfect for riding out the hard months. We came back this year like always, and it was gone." The older girl, Sage, pressed closer to her grandmother, and Mary's hand went automatically to her head, stroking her hair. "We've been walking since noon. We thought maybe we could find another place, somewhere we could shelter. Then we saw your smoke." Eli looked at the map, at all those red marks, claiming and dividing and parceling out land that had been here long before any papers were drawn up. He'd heard about this kind of thing happening, developers pushing into the high country, buying up land for ski resorts or luxury cabins or whatever rich people did with mountains these days. But seeing it laid out like this, seeing what it meant for real people, made something hot and angry rise in his chest. "Your parents?" he asked. Mary's face went still. "Gone. Sage and Willow's mother, my daughter, she was killed 2 years ago, car accident on the reservation. She was a good girl, a good mother. Their father," she shook her head, "he wasn't fit to care for them, so they came to me." The younger girl, Willow, made a small sound, and Mary pulled her close. "We've been managing. But when they took the shelter, when they blocked off the old trails, we had nowhere else to go. I thought we could make it to my cousin's place on the other side of the mountain, but the storm came too fast." She looked up at Eli, and he saw in her face the same thing he'd seen when he opened the door, not pleading exactly, but a simple statement of fact. They were here because they had no other choice. What he did next would determine whether they survived. Eli turned away and went to the window, looking out at the storm. The snow was coming down so thick now he couldn't see past the porch. The wind drove it in sheets, building drifts against anything that stood still. Nobody was going anywhere tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either, depending on how long this lasted. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made himself. No connections, no responsibilities, no chance to fail people again. But those were children out there. No, not out there anymore. In here, in his cabin, wearing his clothes, depending on him to make a choice. "You can stay," he heard himself say, "until the storm passes. There's not much room, but it's warm and dry. I've got food enough to share." He turned back to see Mary's face soften, just slightly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Eli said. "It's going to be close quarters, and I'm not much for company. But nobody deserves to freeze to death because some developers want to put up condos. Mary nodded and took another sip of coffee. The girls had relaxed slightly, though they still watched him with those careful eyes. Eli found himself wondering when they'd last felt safe anywhere. "I'll sleep out here," he said, gesturing to the main room. "You three can have the bedroom. I'll get some bedding sorted out." He moved around the cabin, pulling out extra blankets and pillows, trying not to think too hard about what he'd just agreed to. It was temporary, he told himself, just until the storm passed. Then they'd go their separate ways, and he'd go back to his solitary life. But as he watched Mary help the girls get settled, as he saw the way they held onto each other, he felt something shift inside him, something old and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in 20 years. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't welcome, but it was there, whether he wanted it or not. The storm hammered at the walls, and inside the cabin, 4 people who'd been strangers an hour ago began the uncertain process of learning to share the same small space. Eli lay awake long after the others had gone to bed, listening to the wind and wondering what he'd just invited into his carefully controlled life. Morning came grey and cold, the storm still raging outside. Eli woke to find himself on the floor by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, his back stiff from the hard planks. For a moment, he couldn't place what was different, what had changed. Then he heard its soft voices from the bedroom, Mary speaking in what he assumed was her native language, the girls responding in whispers. He sat up slowly, careful not to make too much noise, and checked the stove. The fire had burned down to coals overnight. He added kindling and fresh wood, waiting until it caught before closing the stove door. The cabin was chilly but not cold. Outside, the world was nothing but white. The bedroom door opened, and Mary emerged, fully dressed now in her own clothes, which she must have dried by the stove during the night. She nodded to him, that small, economical gesture that seemed to be her way of communicating. "Storm's still going," Eli said. "Yes." She moved to the window and looked out. "It'll go another day at least. Maybe 2. You can tell that? My grandmother could tell 3 days out what the weather would do. I learned from her." She turned back to him. "The girls are still sleeping. Should I wake them? Let them rest." Eli stood and stretched, feeling every one of his 56 years. "I'll make some breakfast. You like oatmeal?" "We like whatever you have to share." He set about making breakfast, acutely, aware of Mary watching him move around his own kitchen. It felt strange having someone observe his morning routine, these small rituals he'd performed alone for so long. He measured out oatmeal and water, added a pinch of salt, set it on the stove to cook, cut some bread from the loaf he'd baked 3 days ago, put on coffee. "You live here alone?" Mary asked. "Yes. Long time to be alone." Eli stirred the oatmeal, not looking at her. "Suits me." She didn't sound convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she said, "I'll help. Tell me what needs doing." They worked together in silence, Mary setting the table, Eli serving up the food. When the girls woke and came out, shy and uncertain, Mary spoke to them in their language, and they sat at the table, small and quiet. Eli found himself studying them as they ate. Sage, the older one, had a serious face that didn't quite match her years. She watched everything, processing, measuring. Willow was softer somehow, more openly, fragile, and she kept her eyes down most of the time. After breakfast, the day stretched out before them, undefined and awkward. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Eli was used to spending days inside during bad weather, but he was used to spending them alone. Having 3 other people in his small cabin was like trying to fit too much into too small a space. Everything felt crowded and strange. He busied himself with small tasks, checking the chimney drawer, making sure the window seals were tight, organizing supplies that didn't need organizing. Mary seemed content to sit by the stove with the girls, speaking to them in low voices. Occasionally she'd break into song, soft melodies that reminded Eli of things he couldn't quite place, old things, ancient things, songs that had weight to them. Around mid-morning, Willow asked her grandmother something in their language. Mary responded, then turned to Eli. She wants to know if you have any toys or books for children. Eli paused in his work. No, I don't have anything like that here, Mary translated, and Willow's face fell. Sage put an arm around her sister, protective. But, Eli said, and stopped. What was he doing? But the disappointment in Willow's face pulled at something in him. Wait here. He went to his bedroom and to the dresser in the corner, bottom drawer, under some old sweaters he never wore. His hand closed around a small wooden box, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to pull it out. 20 years this box had sat untouched, 20 years of not looking, not remembering. He brought it back to the main room and set it on the table. The wood was cherry, beautifully carved, with a pattern of leaves and vines. He'd made it himself during Sarah's pregnancy, back when he thought he knew how life was going to unfold. Go ahead, he said to Willow. You can open it. The girl looked to her grandmother, who nodded. Willow reached out and lifted the lid with careful fingers. Inside were a few small things, a rattle Eli had carved, a tiny pair of knit booties, a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, and underneath it all, a photograph. Mary lifted the photograph carefully, and Eli forced himself to look at it. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, standing in front of the cabin, smiling. That smile that had lit up his whole world. He'd taken the picture himself, one of the last good days before everything fell apart. Your wife? Mary asked, her voice gentle. Was. The word came out harder than he intended. She died in childbirth. The baby too, a girl. We were going to name her Grace. The cabin went very quiet. Even the storm seemed to hush for a moment. Mary set the photograph down carefully and looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. I'm sorry, she said. That's a heavy thing to carry. It was a long time ago. Time doesn't make grief lighter. It just makes it familiar. Eli started to put the photograph back, but Sage spoke up her first. Words since arriving. She was beautiful, the girl said in careful English. Your wife. He looked at Sage and saw in her eyes a recognition of loss that shouldn't have been there in someone so young. She'd lost her mother too. She knew. Yes, he said. She was. Willow had lifted out the rattle and was turning it over in her hands, examining the carved patterns. Can I? She started, then stopped, uncertain. You can play with it, Eli said. That's what it's for. The girl shook it gently and smiled at the soft sound it made. It was the first smile he'd seen from either of them, and it did something to his chest, made it feel tight. Mary started to put the other items back in the box, but Eli stopped her. Leave it out, he said. No point in keeping it locked away. They spent the rest of the day in a strange kind of truce, learning to navigate around each other in the small space. Mary showed the girls how to make shapes with string, a game Eli vaguely remembered from his own childhood. He found himself watching them, listening to Mary's patient explanations, the girls' small hands working the string into patterns, a cup, a star, a bridge. When Sage struggled with a particularly complex pattern, Eli surprised himself by kneeling down beside her. Here, he said, loop it like this, then pull that end through. She followed his instructions and the pattern emerged, and she looked up at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust. The storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something was slowly shifting. The rigid boundaries Eli had built around himself were still there, but they had cracks now, small fissures where warmth could seep through. He told himself it was temporary, that he was just being practical until the weather cleared, but part of him knew that wasn't quite true anymore. That night, as they shared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, the cabin felt less like a refuge from the world and more like a small world unto itself. 4 people who'd been strangers were becoming, if not quite a family, then at least companions in circumstance. And on the table the wooden box sat open, no longer a reliquary of grief, but a bridge between past and present, between loss and the possibility, however uncertain, of something new. The second day of the storm brought a different kind of quiet. The initial awkwardness had worn off enough that they could move around each other without constantly apologizing. Eli found himself falling into a rhythm with Mary. She'd start the coffee while he tended the fire. She'd clear the table while he washed the dishes. The girls stayed close to their grandmother but had begun to relax, their movements less guarded. Mid-morning, as Eli sat at the table working through some accounts he'd been putting off, Mary reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. It was worn smooth with age and handling, decorated with tiny beads in a pattern Eli couldn't quite make out. She opened it and the smell of herbs and earth filled the cabin, sweet and sharp at the same time. "What's that?" he asked. "Medicine," Mary said. "Not the kind from a pharmacy. The kind my grandmother taught me to gather. Sage for cleansing and wisdom, cedar for protection, sweetgrass for positive energy." She pinched out a bit of the mixture and held it over the stove until it began to smolder, fragrant smoke rising. Willow and Sage moved closer, familiar with this ritual. Mary moved through the cabin, letting the smoke drift into the corners, speaking softly in her language. Eli watched, uncertain what to make of it but unwilling to dismiss something that clearly mattered. "You think that works?" he asked, when she'd finished. Mary looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "I think intention matters. I think gratitude matters. This cabin has kept us safe and warm. Seems right to honor that." Eli had no answer to that. His mother would have understood, he thought. She'd believed in prayers and blessings, in acknowledging forces larger than oneself. He'd lost that somewhere along the way, or maybe he'd thrown it away deliberately, angry at a God who'd taken Sarah and his daughter. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. Mary settled into the chair across from him, the medicine pouch still in her hands. The girls went back to their string games, but Eli could tell they were listening too. "Her name was Walking Dawn," Mary said. "She was born in 1890, back when the old ways still held strong. By the time I knew her, things had changed, reservations, boarding schools, all of it. But she kept the knowledge alive, taught me which plants to gather, when to gather them, how to prepare them, taught me the songs, the stories, the things that matter. She lived through a lot," Eli said. "More than anyone should have to." Mary's fingers traced the beadwork on the pouch, but she didn't let it make her hard. She used to. Say that bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Better to carry what wisdom you could forward and let go of what would only weigh you down. Sage looked up from her string. "Grandma says the same thing to us." "Because it's still true," Mary said. "Will always be true." Eli thought about that, about bitterness, about what he'd been carrying for 20 years. Was it wisdom or was it poison? He honestly wasn't sure anymore. "Your turn," Mary said, startling him. "Tell me about your mother. The Bible on the mantel, it was hers?" He glanced at the worn leather book still sitting where it always sat. Yes, she was a woman of faith. Real faith, not the kind people put on for show. She'd pray over everything, the crops, the animals, sick neighbors. My father, when he was out working dangerous jobs, seemed like God listened to her too. Things had a way of working out when she asked for help. "You don't believe anymore?" The directness of the messant question caught him off guard. "I don't know what I believe. When Sarah died, when my daughter died, I asked for help, prayed harder than I'd ever prayed for anything. And they died anyway, both of them, while I stood there helpless." He stopped, surprised by how much he'd said. "So you decided God wasn't listening," Mary said. "It wasn't a question. I decided I couldn't count on anyone but myself." Mary opened the medicine pouch again and selected a few dried leaves, which she crumbled into her palm. "My daughter Sage and Willow's mother, she was coming back from a church meeting when the accident happened. Church meeting. She was faithful like your mother. Said her prayers every night, taught these girls to do the same, and she died anyway, young, with so much life left to live." The girls had gone very still. Mary noticed and switched to English, speaking directly to them. "Your mama was good and faithful, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. That doesn't mean the good doesn't matter. It doesn't mean the faith doesn't matter. It just means we live in a world where we don't always get to understand why." She turned back to Eli. I was angry too, after she died. Angry at God, angry at the drunk driver, angry at everyone and everything. But anger is heavy, Eli. Carries it long enough, and it'll break your back. So what did you do? I decided that I could be angry, or I could raise these girls right. Both would take more energy than I had, so I had to choose. She looked at her granddaughters with such love, it was almost painful to witness. I chose them. The cabin fell quiet again, just the sound of the fire and the wind outside. Eli felt something loosening in his chest, some knot he'd tied so long ago he'd forgotten it was there. The string patterns, he said, changing the subject because it was all too much. Where did those come from? My grandmother taught me. Her mother taught her. Goes back further than anyone remembers. Each pattern tells a story. See this one? Mary took the string from Sage and worked it between her fingers, creating an intricate web. This is the spider's web. Reminds us that we're all connected, that what we do ripples out and touches others. She handed the string to Eli. Try it. He hesitated, then took it. His hands, rough from ranch work, felt clumsy with the thin cord. Mary guided him through the steps, patient, correcting when he went wrong. Willow giggled when he tangled it completely, and instead of being annoyed, Eli found himself smiling. Like this, Sage said, and showed him again, her small fingers quick and sure. They spent the next hour like that, Mary teaching him the patterns she knew, the girls joining in, correcting his mistakes, celebrating when he got one right. It was simple, even silly maybe, but it felt important somehow, this passing of knowledge, this small act of trust. Later, when the girls had curled up for an afternoon nap and Mary was preparing vegetables for dinner, Eli found himself at the window, looking out at the endless white. The storm was still going strong, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt more like a cocoon, holding them all in this small space where normal life and its rules didn't quite apply. Thank you, he said. Mary looked up from her cutting. For what? For the stories, the patterns. For, he struggled to find words, for not letting me sit in my own silence. She nodded, understanding more than he'd said. We all need pulling out of ourselves sometimes. Otherwise, we forget we're human. That night, as the fire burned low and they prepared for bed, Eli took the Bible down from the mantel for the first time in 20 years. He didn't open it, just held it, feeling the weight of it, the memory of his mother's voice, reading from it on long winter evenings much like this one. Mary saw him with it and smiled, just slightly. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. Small changes, Eli thought. Small openings in the walls he'd built. He wasn't sure what it meant or where it would lead. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't completely alone with his grief. And that, he was beginning to realize, made all the difference. The third morning dawned different. Eli woke to silence, not the howling silence of the storm, but true quiet. He got up and went to the window, and for the first time in 3 days he could see more than 5 feet beyond the glass. The storm had passed. The world outside was transformed, buried under at least 4 feet of fresh snow that caught the early light and threw it back in shades of blue and silver. The sky was clear, that deep blue you only get after a big storm, and the sun was just cresting the eastern peaks. It's over, Mary said from behind him. She'd come out of the bedroom so quietly he hadn't heard her. Yes, you'll be able to travel in a day or 2, once I dig out and the main trails firm up a bit. He expected relief from her. They'd be able to leave, get back to their lives. Instead, her face showed something more complicated. Yes, she said, I suppose we will. They made breakfast together, a routine that felt natural now. When the girls woke, they were excited to see the sun, pressing their faces to the window and exclaiming over the deep snow. Eli found himself explaining how to judge snow depth, which drifts were safe to walk on, how the temperature would affect the snow's consistency. Mary listened as intently as the girls, and he realized she was learning too, gathering knowledge the way some people gathered firewood because you never knew when you might need it. After breakfast, Eli bundled up and went outside to start the work of digging out. The snow came up past his knees in places, and the drifts against the cabin were higher than his head. He had his work cut out for him, but it felt good to be moving, to be working with his hands toward a clear goal. He'd been at it about an hour when Mary came out, dressed in her own clothes, now fully dry, with his heavy coat over them. "Show me what to do," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. Show me anyway." So he gave her a shovel and showed her how to clear the snow efficiently, how to throw it so you didn't have to move it twice. They worked in companionable silence, just the sound of their breathing and the scrape of shovels against wood and ice. "You're good at this," Eli said after a while. "Physical work?" Mary smiled slightly. "I've done plenty of it. You don't get to be 72 on the reservation without learning how to work hard." 72. Eli paused in his shoveling. "You don't look it. Clean living and spite," she said, and he found himself laughing, the first real laugh he'd had in longer than he could remember. They worked for another hour before taking a break. Sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the glittering expanse of snow, Eli felt something shift. The cabin behind them held sage and willow, warm and safe. Mary sat beside him, solid and real. For 3 days he'd been living outside his own rules, and the world hadn't ended. Maybe that meant something. "Can I ask you something?" Mary said. "Go ahead. Why did you let us in that first night? You could have turned us away." Eli considered the question. "I don't know. I wanted to turn you away. Spent 20 years making sure I didn't have to be responsible for anyone else. But when I saw you standing there with those girls," he shook his head, "I couldn't do it. Couldn't be that person. The person who let them freeze. The person who chose his own safety over doing what was right." Mary nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they think or what they say. It's what they do when doing the right thing costs them something. It's cost me peace of mind," Eli said, trying for humor, but not quite getting. "There. 3 days of crowded space and noise, and having to think about people besides myself. Terrible," Mary said, but her tone was gentle, teasing almost. "It has been," Eli said, and found he meant it. "Terrible in the way that waking up from a long sleep is terrible. Everything's too bright, too loud, too much. Easier to just stay sleeping. But you can't stay asleep forever." "No," he agreed. "I suppose you can't." They went back inside for lunch, and while Mary warmed up the soup she'd made the day before, Eli went to his bedroom and opened the top drawer of his dresser. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with string. He'd written them over the years, letters to Sarah, letters to the daughter he'd never known. Grief counseling, some would call it. Eli just thought of it as talking to ghosts. He untied the bundle and pulled out the most recent one, written just 2 months ago. His handwriting looked shaky on the paper, uncertain. He read through it the same litany of loneliness he'd been reciting for years, the same questions that had no answers. On impulse, he took the letter to the stove and fed it to the fire. The paper curled and blackened and turned to ash. Then another letter, and another. One by one, he burned them, watching 20 years of frozen grief go up in smoke. Mary saw what he was doing but didn't comment. She just ladled out soup and set the bowls on the table. When Eli had burned the last letter, he tied up the empty string and threw that in the fire too. "Feels lighter?" Mary asked. "Feels terrifying," Eli admitted. "Those letters were, I don't know, proof that I'd loved them, proof that I hadn't forgotten. Love doesn't need proof, and memory doesn't need paper." She tapped her chest. "It's here. Can't burn that." After lunch, Sage approached Eli shyly. "Will you show me how to carve?" she asked. "Like the rattle you made." Eli hesitated. He hadn't carved anything since that rattle, since before Sarah died, but the girl's face was so hopeful, so open. "All right," he said. "Let me find some soft wood." He set her up at the table with a piece of pine and his smallest knife, showing her how to hold it safely, how to let the grain guide her cuts. Willow wanted to try too, so he found her an even softer piece and supervised them both. Mary watched from her chair by the stove, something like contentment on her weathered face. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, turning the snow outside to gold, the cabin filled with the small sounds of living wood shavings falling, the scrape of knife on pine, the murmur of Mary's voice as she told the girls a story in their language, the crack and pop of the fire. Eli carved too, his hands remembering skills they'd thought lost. He shaped the wood into a bird, wings spread, ready for flight. When it was done, he smoothed it with sandpaper and handed it to Willow. "For you," he said. Her face lit up like sunrise, and she held the bird carefully, in both hands, as if it might actually fly away. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as they prepared for bed, Eli realized he was dreading tomorrow, the day when they'd have to start talking about leaving, about going their separate ways. The cabin would be empty again, silent again. He'd have exactly what he'd thought he wanted. So why did the prospect fill him with something that felt like grief? Mary seemed to sense his mood. "One more day," she said quietly, as if reading his mind. "Then we'll figure out what comes next. One more day." It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to, and right now, that was enough. The fourth day brought unexpected complications. Eli had been listening to his battery-powered radio, checking the weather and road reports, when he heard something that made him go still. Mary noticed immediately. "What is it?" He turned up the volume. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. "Avalanche warnings remain in effect for the high country. Several secondary roads are closed indefinitely due to slides and unsafe conditions. Authorities are advising against all non-essential travel in the mountain areas until further notice." Eli switched off the radio. Mary was watching him, understanding dawning on her face. "We can't leave yet," she said. "Not safely. The pass you'd need to take to reach your cousin, it'll be buried. Could be a week or more before it's clear." Mary sat down heavily. "A week, maybe longer. Depends on the melt and whether there are more storms." Eli felt torn between relief at having more time and guilt at being relieved. "I'm sorry. I know you need to get back to your life." "What life?" The words came out bitter. "The shelter's gone. The land is being sold off piece by piece. We have nowhere to go back to, Eli. That's the truth of it." The girls had been playing with the carved animals, but they went quiet at their grandmother's tone. Sage moved closer to Mary, protective. Eli went to the window, looking out at the mountains that could be either prison or sanctuary, depending on how you looked at it. "There's something I haven't told you," he said. "Something that might matter." "What?" "This cabin, this land, it's mine. 50 acres, bought and paid for. Been here 30 years. He turned to face her. "I know it doesn't solve everything, but while the passes are closed, you're welcome to stay. Not as guests who've worn out their welcome, but just stay." Mary looked at him for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because maybe I'm tired of being alone. Or maybe because it's the right thing to do. Or maybe—" He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "Maybe you're starting to remember what it feels like to be part of something," Mary said softly. Before Eli could respond, there was a sound outside an engine, grinding and struggling through the snow. They both went to the window and saw a pickup truck fighting its way up the trail. Four-wheel drive engaged, throwing up rooster tails of snow. "You expecting anyone?" Mary asked. "No." The truck pulled up to the cabin, and a man got out middle-aged, wearing an expensive jacket that looked wrong for the setting, carrying a leather folder. He saw Eli in the window and waved, friendly enough, but something about him put Eli's hackles up. Eli stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" "Eli Thatcher?" The man's smile was practiced. "Name's Richard Vance. I'm with Mountain Vista Development Corporation. Wondered if I could have a moment of your time. This about the land." "Smart man." Vance climbed the porch steps without being invited. "I'll cut right to it. We're buying up properties in this area for a new resort development. Premium ski access, luxury cabins, the whole package. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your 50 acres. Not interested. You haven't heard the offer yet. Vance opened his folder and pulled out a document. $200,000. More than generous for land this remote. Eli didn't look at the paper. Still not interested. Vance's smile flickered. Mr. Thatcher, be reasonable. This is an opportunity. You're sitting on property that's about to become very valuable. Get in now, on our terms, and you walk away with more money than you'd make in 10 years of... He gestured at the cabin, the snow, everything, whatever it is you do up here. I said no. Look, I understand attachment to land. I do. But the development's happening whether you sell or not. We've got the parcels on all sides of you. You'll be an island in the middle of a resort. No privacy, no quiet, just tourists and construction. Better to take the money and find somewhere else. Through the window, Eli could see Mary standing very still, the map with all its red marks suddenly making terrible sense. This was what had happened to her shelter, her ancestral lands. This same smooth-talking man with his folder, and his money and his certainty that everything could be bought. The answer is no, Eli said, his voice gone cold. And it'll stay no. You can come back with twice that offer or 10 times that offer, and the answer will still be no. This is my land, and I'm staying on it. Vance's friendliness evaporated. You're making a mistake. We can make this easy, or we can make this hard. Easy is you take the money and go. Hard is we develop around you and make your life so miserable you leave anyway without the money. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Vance tucked the document back in his folder. Think about it, Mr. Thatcher. I'll be in touch. He went back to his truck and drove away, the engine noise gradually fading into the distance. Eli stood on the porch long after he'd gone, fury and something deeper churning in his chest. Mary came out, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. That's the man, she said. Not him specifically, but men like him. That's who took our shelter, who marked up our land like it was nothing. They can't force me to sell, Eli said. This is my property, legal and clear. They'll find a way. Mary's voice was tired, resigned. They always find a way. Pressure from the county, taxes raised until you can't afford to pay, access roads closed for maintenance. They make it impossible to stay, and then they buy it for pennies when you're desperate. Eli looked at her, at the weight of experience in her face. That what happened to your family's land? Some of it, yes. Not the ancestral areas, those were taken outright 100 years ago. But the pieces we had left, the places we'd managed to hold on to, slowly they got whittled away. One generation loses a piece here, another loses a piece there, until you're left with nothing but the memory of what used to be yours. I won't let that happen here. You might not have a choice. They went back inside, and Eli saw the girls watching them with worried eyes. They'd heard enough to understand that something was wrong, even if they didn't grasp all the details. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Eli and Mary sat by the stove, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. I've been thinking, Mary said finally, about what you said earlier, about staying. You don't have to decide anything now, but I do need to think about it. Not just for me, but for them. She gestured toward the bedroom. They need stability, safety, somewhere they won't be forced to move again just when they've started to feel settled. They could have that here, Eli said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. All 3 of you could. For how long? Until the developers squeeze you out, until they make your life impossible. I'll fight them. One man against a corporation? Mary shook her head. I've seen how that ends. Then maybe it's time someone changed the ending. Eli leaned forward, intensity in his voice. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I don't. But I know I'm tired of running from things, tired of hiding. Maybe it's time to stand and hold the line. Mary studied him in the firelight. You really mean that? Yes. Even though it'll be hard, even though you might lose, even though... He met her eyes. These past few days, having you here, the girls, it's woken something up in me, something I thought I'd buried for good. Maybe that's worth fighting for. Maybe, You're worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, more than friendly, less than romantic, but weighted with meaning nonetheless. Mary didn't look away. "Then we'll need a plan," she said, "because if we're going to fight, we'd better fight smart." Eli felt something settle in his chest. Purpose, direction, the first clear sense of mission he'd had in 20 years. He wasn't alone anymore, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and bright and indifferent. But inside the cabin, 4 people were beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to give up, refusing to let go, refusing to surrender what matters most. The battle hadn't begun yet, but the lines were being drawn. 2 days after Vance's visit, Eli was going through old papers in a trunk he kept in the bedroom closet. He'd been looking for his original deed, thinking he might need it if the developers came back with lawyers. Mary was teaching the girls a traditional song in the main room, their voices blending in a melody that made the cabin feel more like a home than it ever had. The trunk was full of documents he'd accumulated over 30 years, purchase agreements, tax records, maintenance receipts. He'd always been meticulous about keeping records, a habit his father had drilled into him. Near the bottom, underneath a bundle of old receipts, his hand touched something he didn't recognize. A leather portfolio, cracked with age. Eli pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside were papers, yellowed and brittle, covered in handwriting he had to squint to read. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at, and when he did, his heart began to pound. "Mary," he called, his voice strange even to his own ears. "Mary, come here. You need to see this." She appeared in the doorway, concern on her face. "What is it?" "I'm not sure, but I think—" He spread the papers on the bed. "Help me read these." Mary came closer, putting on the reading glasses she kept in her pocket. Together they went through the documents, and with each page the picture became clearer and more impossible. The papers were part of an original land grant from 1882, surveyed and documented by a territorial clerk named Jonathan Harding. But these weren't just property records. They were treaty documents, supplementary agreements made between the territorial government and the Northern Cheyenne, delineating specific areas that were to remain in perpetuity as traditional use lands, protected from settlement, protected from sale, protected from development. And according to the survey map included in the portfolio, Eli's 50 acres sat directly in the middle of one of these protected zones. "How did you get these?" Mary's voice was shaking. "I don't know. They were in this trunk when I bought the property from the previous owner, old man named Harding." Eli stopped. Harding. Same name as the surveyor. His descendant, maybe, kept the papers hidden. But why? If this land was protected, why was it sold to me at all? Mary was studying the map, her finger tracing the boundaries. Because someone buried these documents. Someone made these protections disappear so the land could be sold. She looked up at him, and her face was fierce. "This isn't just your 50 acres, Eli. Look at the boundaries." He looked. The protected zone, outlined in the 1882 map, encompassed roughly 2,000 acres, including every parcel the developers had been buying up, including the site of Mary's family's winter shelter. "If these documents are legitimate," Eli said slowly, "then none of these sales are legal. The entire development project would be built on land that was never theirs to develop." Mary sat down on the bed. The papers spread around her. "This is why they want your property so badly. You're the last piece. Once they have you, they control the whole area and no one can challenge them. But if you stand firm, if you have proof that the land was protected, they lose everything." Eli felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. "But Mary, these papers are over 140 years old. Will they even hold up? I don't know. But I know people who might. Tribal council, maybe. Legal aid societies that specialize in treaty rights." She carefully gathered the papers. "This could change everything. Not just for you, not just for us, for everyone who's been pushed off this land over the past century. It could also make us targets. Mary met his eyes, and he saw in her face the same determination he felt rising in himself. We were already targets the moment we refused to go quietly. They spent the rest of the day examining every document in the trunk, looking for anything else that might be relevant. Eli found his original purchase deed and saw now what he hadn't noticed 30 years ago, how carefully worded it was, how it avoided any mention of the land's history, how the seller had been in a hurry to close the deal and move away. He knew, Eli said, showing Mary the deed. Harding's grandson, or whoever he was, he knew these documents existed. He knew the land was protected. That's why he sold it to me so cheap and got out fast. He didn't want to be around when the truth came out, or when the developers came calling, Mary added. They probably tried to buy from him first. He sold to you instead, maybe hoping you'd fight them, or maybe just not caring what happened next. As evening fell, they sat at the table with the documents spread before them. The girls had been told something important was happening, and they sat quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. We need to make copies, Eli said. Multiple copies. Store them in different places. If the developers find out we have these, they'll do whatever it takes to make them disappear, Mary finished. Along with us, maybe. Don't say that in front of the girls. They need to know what's at stake. They're old enough to understand danger. Mary put her arms around both girls. We've been running and hiding and getting pushed around for too long. Maybe it's time to push back, Sage spoke up, her voice small but firm. Grandma says we come from warriors. She says our ancestors fought for this land. They did, Mary confirmed, and some of them died for it. But they fought anyway, because some things are worth fighting for. Eli looked at this makeshift family that had come into his life just days ago, but already felt essential. I need you to understand something, he said. If we do this, if we go public with these documents, there's no going back. The developers will come after us with everything they have. Legal pressure, maybe worse. It won't be safe. It's never been safe, Mary said. Not for my people. We've been under threat since the first white men arrived. At least now we have something to fight with. She touched the old papers gently. These are more than just documents. They're proof that someone, 140 years ago, tried to do the right thing, tried to protect this land and the people who belong to it. We owe it to that person to make sure their effort wasn't wasted. Then we fight, Eli said. Then we fight, Mary agreed. They spent the next hour making careful photographs of each document with Eli's old camera. Mary knew someone in town with a photocopier, someone they could trust. They'd make multiple copies, store them with different people, make sure the evidence couldn't be disappeared, even if Eli didn't let himself finish that thought. Instead, he focused on the practical steps, the concrete actions they could take. But underneath the planning, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. A sense of purpose that extended beyond his own survival. He was part of something larger now, something that mattered. Later, after the girls had gone to bed, Eli and Mary stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. Are you scared? Mary asked. Terrified, Eli admitted. But in a good way, in a way that makes me feel alive. I know what you mean. She was quiet for a moment. When my daughter died, I thought about giving up. Thought about how much easier it would be to just stop fighting, stop trying. But then I'd look at those girls, and I'd know I couldn't. They deserved better than a grandmother who quit. You could never quit, Eli said. It's not in you. Maybe not. But I've been tired for a long time. These past few days, though, she shook her head. I feel less tired. Feel like maybe there's still fight left in this old body. You're not old, she laughed softly. 72 isn't young, Eli. No, but it's not done either. My mother used to say that we're not finished until God decides we're finished. And until then, we keep working. Wise woman, your mother. They stood in comfortable silence, and Eli felt the rightness of this moment, this decision. Tomorrow they'd start making calls, reaching out to people who might help. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, in this cabin that had become a sanctuary, they had each other, and they had the truth. Sometimes that was enough to start a war. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it was enough to win one. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but they'd seen countless battles over the centuries, countless stands for justice and honor and simple human dignity. They'd be witnesses to one more, and maybe this time the outcome would be different. Maybe this time the people would win. The next morning, Eli made the long hike down to where his truck was parked, 3 miles down the mountain where the main road had been plowed. The exercise felt good after days cooped up in the cabin, but his mind was racing ahead, planning, strategizing. He needed to get to town, make copies of the documents, start making calls. The truck started reluctantly in the cold, and he drove carefully down roads still slick with ice. The small town of Whitefish looked like it always did, quiet, practical, going about its business. But Eli saw it differently now. Behind every storefront might be someone who'd been approached by the developers, pressured to sell, or threatened if they didn't. His first stop was the tribal council office on the reservation, an hour's drive from town. Mary had given him the name of a man she trusted, Thomas Redcloud, chairman of the council. Eli had called ahead from a payphone, explaining briefly what he'd found. Redcloud had told him to come immediately. The council office was a modest building, warm and cluttered with file boxes and historical photographs. Thomas Redcloud was a man in his 60s, with grey hair in a ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. He examined the photocopies Eli had brought with an intensity that made the younger men in the office go quiet. "Do you understand what you have here?" Redcloud asked finally. "I think so, but I need you to tell me if I'm right. These are legitimate treaty supplementals from 1882. I've seen references to them in historical records, but everyone thought they'd been destroyed or lost." Redcloud spread the pages out on his desk. "If these hold up to legal scrutiny, and I believe they will, they invalidate every land sale in this area for the past 70 years. How is that possible? Because treaty lands can't be sold by private individuals. They're held in trust, protected by federal law. Someone, sometime around 1950 by my guess, buried these documents and started selling off the land anyway, made themselves a fortune doing it." Redcloud looked up at Eli. "You realize what this means? That a lot of people are going to be very angry, that a lot of powerful people are going to lose a lot of money. And they won't go down without a fight." Redcloud picked up his phone. "I'm calling our legal team. We need to move fast. Get these documents authenticated, filed with the federal court, make them a matter of public record before anyone can make them disappear." "How long will that take?" "If we push it, 24 hours maybe. But those will be the most dangerous 24 hours of your life. Once word gets out what you've found, the pressure will be enormous." Eli thought of Mary and the girls back at the cabin. What kind of pressure? Legal threats? Intimidation? Maybe? Worse, these developers have millions invested. They won't let one man and some old papers stand in their way without exhausting every option. Redcloud fixed him with a steady gaze. "Are you prepared for that?" "I don't have much choice. The land's protected. The truth needs to come out." "You always have a choice. You could walk away, sell to the developers, take the money and leave. Nobody would blame you." "I'd blame me," Eli said quietly. "And there are 3 people at my cabin who've already lost too much to these same developers. I won't let them lose again." Redcloud smiled slightly. "Mary Blackfeather and her granddaughters. She called this morning, said you'd be coming, said I could trust you. She did. Mary's a good woman. Lost a lot, but never lost her spine. If she says you're solid, that's good enough for me." He stood and extended his hand. "Let's make some noise." The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls, faxes, and urgent meetings. The tribal legal team moved with impressive speed, photographing every document, cross-referencing historical records, preparing legal filings. By late afternoon, they had what they needed. "We're filing in federal court tonight," the lead attorney told Eli. "Emergency motion to halt all development activity pending review of treaty protections. It'll take a few days for the hearing, but once we file, it's public record. Everyone will know. including the developers. Especially the developers. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Yellowtail, didn't sugarcoat it. They'll come after you with everything they have. Harassment, legal pressure, possibly violence. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay? My cabin. It's remote, defensible. Good. Don't stay alone if you can help it. And Eli. She put a hand on his arm. Thank you. What you're doing, it matters. More than you know. Eli drove back to Whitefish as the sun was setting, stopping at the general store for supplies. He was loading them into the truck when he saw Richard Vance's pickup parked across the street. The developer was standing on the sidewalk, phone to his ear, and when he saw Eli, he ended his call and walked over. Mr. Thatcher, funny running into you here. Is it? Eli kept loading groceries. Heard you've been busy today. Making friends with the tribal council, I'm told. Vance's tone was casual, but his eyes were hard. That's interesting timing, given our recent conversation. I'm allowed to talk to whoever I want. Of course. Just interesting, that's all. Makes me wonder what you might be talking about. Vance leaned against the truck. See, we've invested a lot in this development. A lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of promises to people who expect returns. We can't have complications. That sounds like a problem. It could become one. For everyone involved. The threat was barely veiled now, but it doesn't have to be. We're still willing to buy your property. In fact, given the, shall we say, circumstances, we're prepared to increase our offer. 300,000. Not interested. 400,000. Vance's voice went flat. That's my final offer, Eli. Take it now. Walk away clean. Or refuse it and face the consequences. Eli closed the truck bed and turned to face Vance directly. I'm not selling. Not for 400,000. Not for 4 million. That land is protected by treaty law, and you know it. You've known it all along, haven't you? That's why you've been pushing so hard, moving so fast. You wanted everything locked down before anyone could dig into the real history. Vance's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, and by tomorrow morning everyone else will too. We're filing in federal court tonight. Everything goes public. You're making a serious mistake. No, Eli said. I'm correcting one that's been standing for 70 years. He got in his truck and drove away, watching Vance in the mirror. The developer was already on his phone again, and Eli knew the real battle was about to begin. The drive back to the cabin took 2 hours in the dark, following snow-packed roads with only his headlights to guide him. When he finally pulled up, the cabin windows were glowing warm, and he felt something in his chest ease. Home. Strange how quickly that had happened. Mary met him at the door, reading his face immediately. It's done? Filing tonight. By morning, it's public record. She nodded, understanding the weight of that. Then we'd better prepare. They spent the evening getting ready, checking that the generator had fuel, making sure they had enough food and water for a siege, if it came to that, going over escape routes if they needed to leave quickly. The girls watched with serious faces, helping where they could, understanding that something big was about to happen. I'm scared, Willow admitted as Mary tucked them into bed. That's okay, Mary said, smoothing her hair. Brave people feel scared too. They just don't let the fear stop them from doing what's right. Is Eli brave? Sage asked. Mary glanced at him standing in the doorway. Yes, very brave. After the girls were asleep, Eli and Mary sat by the stove, neither of them wanting to go to bed, both knowing that sleep would be hard to come by tonight anyway. Whatever happens tomorrow, Mary said, I want you to know something. These past days they've meant more to me than I can say. You gave us shelter when we had nowhere to go. You're fighting for land that isn't even yours. Not really. You didn't have to do any of it. Yes, I did, Eli said. I was dying up here, Mary. Dying slowly, alone, convinced that was what I deserved. You and the girls, you reminded me that life is for living, not just enduring. You gave me something to fight for. I should be thanking you. Maybe we saved each other then. Maybe we did. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. Somewhere in the darkness, forces were aligning against them. Lawyers were being called, strategies were being formed, pressure was being applied. By tomorrow, their quiet cabin would be at the center of a storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with power and greed, and who had the right to decide the fate of the land. But for now, in this moment, they had peace, they had each other, they had the truth, and sometimes, Eli thought, that was enough to stand against the whole world. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. They'd face it together, and they'd face it with their heads up and their hearts strong. The fight was coming, but they were ready as they'd ever be. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and bright. Inside, 4 people who'd become a family in less than a week prepared for the battle that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of land that had been fought over and died for since before any of them were born. The night wore on, and morning, with all its uncertainty and promise, grew steadily closer. They came at dawn. Eli heard the engines first, multiple vehicles grinding up the mountain trail. He was up immediately, pulling on his boots, moving to the window. 3 trucks, maybe 4, all bearing the Mountain Vista Development logo. Behind them, 2 county sheriff's vehicles. "Mary," he called quietly, not wanting to wake the girls yet. "We have company." She appeared from the bedroom, already dressed. She'd been awake too then. They'd both been listening through the night for this moment. The vehicles stopped 50 yards from the cabin, arranged in a loose semicircle. Doors opened, and men got out. Vance and several others in business attire, 2 sheriff's deputies in uniform, and 3 men who looked like private. Security. One of the security men was holding a camera, documenting everything. Vance took the lead, walking toward the cabin, with the deputies flanking him. Eli stepped out onto the porch, leaving Mary inside with the girls, who were awake now, peering through the window. "Mr. Thatcher," Vance called out. "We need to talk." "Then talk. These deputies are here to serve you with a cease and desist order. You're in possession of stolen property documents belonging to Mountain Vista Development Corporation, and we're demanding their immediate return. Those documents don't belong to you. They're historical records proving this land is protected by treaty law. That's a legal question that'll be determined in court," one of the deputies said, stepping forward. He was young, uncomfortable with this. "Sir, I need you to turn over any documents relating to land surveys or treaties from the 1880 seconds. Do you have a warrant?" "We have a court order, which I'd like to see." The deputy handed over a paper, and Eli read it carefully. It was a temporary restraining order, signed by a county judge that morning, demanding the return of stolen proprietary documents. The legal language was vague enough to be almost meaningless, but it had the weight of a court signature behind it. "This is trash," Eli said, handing it back. "Those documents were in my possession legally. They came with the property when I bought it 30 years ago. Then you won't mind turning them over so we can verify that claim," Vance said smoothly. "I would mind, because the minute I hand them to you, they'll disappear. Just like they disappeared once before, just like you wanted them to stay disappeared. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth." Eli crossed his arms. "And by now, the tribal council has filed their motion in federal court. Those documents are part of a legal proceeding. I'm not handing them over to anyone except a federal judge." Vance's expression hardened. "Deputy, I want this man arrested for obstruction and theft." The deputy looked uncertain. "Sir, I'm not sure we have grounds. You have a court order. Execute it." "Now wait just a minute," Eli said. "You can't just—" The door opened behind him, and Mary stepped out onto the porch. The 2 girls were with her, pressed close to her sides, fear evident on their small faces but standing their ground. "This is our home," Mary said, her voice carrying clear across the snow. "You have no right to come here and threaten us." Vance's eyes widened slightly when he saw them. "Mrs. Blackfeather. What a surprise. I heard you'd been displaced by the weather. Didn't realize you'd taken up residence here. Where else would we go? You destroyed our shelter. You've been destroying everything we have, piece by piece. We're simply developing the area according to all applicable laws, according to laws that never should have existed. Mary cut him off. According to sales that never should have happened. This is treaty land, Mr. Vance. It always has been. You know it, your company knows it, and now everyone else will know it too. One of the security men moved forward, and Eli stepped in front of Mary and the girls. That's far enough. We're just here to serve a legal order, the man said, but his hand had moved to his belt, where Eli could see the outline of a weapon. Nobody's serving anything, Eli said. Not without a proper warrant from a federal judge. This county paper doesn't mean anything when treaty law is involved. The standoff held, tension crackling in the cold morning air. The deputies looked at each other, clearly not eager to escalate this into physical confrontation. Vance was calculating, weighing options. The security men waited for orders. Then, from down the trail, came the sound of more vehicles. Everyone turned to look. 2 trucks were approaching, and when they got closer, Eli recognized Thomas Red Cloud in the lead vehicle. Behind him were several other tribal council members, and thank God a news van from the Missoula television station. The cavalry had arrived. Vance saw them too, and Eli watched his expression change from confident aggression to barely controlled fury. A camera meant witnesses. Witnesses meant he couldn't use the tactics he might have employed in private. This isn't over, Vance said quietly, just for Eli's ears. No, Eli agreed. It's just beginning. The tribal council vehicles pulled up, and Red Cloud got out, moving with calm authority. The news crew was already filming, the reporter speaking urgently into her microphone. And on the porch of his small cabin, Eli stood with Mary and the girls, facing down the men who'd thought they could buy and bully their way to whatever they wanted. The battle had been joined, and the whole state was about to watch how it played out. Thomas Red Cloud approached with the calm confidence of a man who knew he was on the right side of history. The news camera followed him, capturing everything: the standoff, the frightened children, the armed security guards, facing down an old cowboy and a native grandmother on their own porch. "Gentlemen," Red Cloud said, his voice carrying authority. "I'm Thomas Red Cloud, chairman of the Tribal Council. I'm here to inform you that as of 7 o'clock this morning, Federal Judge Patricia Morrison issued an emergency injunction halting all development activity in this area, pending review of treaty protections." He held up a document. "This is a federal order. It supersedes any county-level proceedings." Vance's face went pale. "That's impossible. We just filed our motion this morning," and Judge Morrison reviewed it immediately. "She found sufficient evidence to warrant an emergency halt. Your company's activities are suspended, effective immediately." The reporter moved closer, microphone extended. "Mr. Vance, can you comment on allegations that Mountain Vista Development knew this land was protected by treaty law?" "No comment," Vance snapped. "Is it true your company has been systematically buying land that was never legally available for sale?" I said no comment, but the damage was done. The camera had captured everything: the intimidation attempt, the children, the armed guards, Vance's fury, and the deputy's discomfort. This would be on the evening news, and with it would come questions the company wouldn't be able to dodge. Sarah Yellowtail, the tribal attorney, emerged from one of the council vehicles with a briefcase full of documents. She addressed the deputies directly. "This county cease and desist order was obtained under false pretenses. The documents in question are historical records, not proprietary property. We have copies filed with federal court, and Mr. Thatcher is under no obligation to surrender the originals to anyone except a federal authority." The deputy, who'd been trying to serve the order, looked relieved. "Ma'am, if there's a federal injunction in place, that's above my pay grade. We're going to need to consult with the county attorney before proceeding." "That would be wise," Yellowtail agreed. Vance was on his phone now, speaking in urgent, angry tones. His security team looked uncertain, and the second deputy was already heading back to his vehicle. The carefully orchestrated intimidation was falling apart, and everyone could see it. Mary squeezed Eli's hand, and he looked down to see Sage and Willow watching everything with wide eyes. They were witnessing something important, he realized. They were seeing what it looked like when people stood up and refused to be moved. The reporter approached Eli. "Sir, can I ask you a few questions?" He hesitated, then nodded. Mary stayed close beside him. "You're Eli Thatcher? You own this property?" "I do. Bought it legally 30 years ago, though I'm learning now that maybe it never should have been for sale in the first place." "Can you explain what happened here this morning? These men came to my home with armed security and tried to intimidate me into giving up historical documents that prove this land is protected. They wanted to silence the truth before it could come out. But the truth is out now, and no amount of pressure is going to put it back in the box." "And your relationship with Mrs. Blackfeather?" Mary stepped forward. "I'm Mary Blackfeather. My granddaughters and I were displaced when this company destroyed our winter shelter land my family has used for generations. Mr. Thatcher gave us shelter during the storm. He's been helping us fight to protect what should never have been taken in the first place. So, this is about more than just one property? This is about justice," Mary said firmly. "It's about honoring agreements made over a century ago. It's about respecting the land and the people who've cared for it. And it's about saying no to corporations who think everything can be bought." The camera captured it all. Vance was getting back in his truck now, his security team following. The deputies had already left. The standoff was over, at least for now. As the vehicles pulled away, leaving deep ruts in the snow, Eli felt something release in his chest. They'd stood firm, they'd faced down the pressure, and they'd won the day. Red Cloud came up onto the porch, smiling. "That went better than I expected." "Will the injunction hold?" Eli asked. "Judge Morrison is thorough and fair. She'll review the evidence properly. And with the media attention now," he gestured to the news van, "it'll be hard for anyone to make this go away quietly. You've got public opinion on your side." The reporter was wrapping up her segment, and Eli could hear her closing words. "A story of ordinary people standing up to powerful interests, and a reminder that sometimes the past holds answers we've forgotten." This is Jennifer Walsh, reporting from the high country where justice might finally be coming home. After the news crew left, Red Cloud and his team stayed for coffee, going over the legal strategy going forward. It would take time, months, maybe years, to fully resolve the treaty questions, but the emergency injunction meant the land was protected while the case proceeded. "You did something important today," Red Cloud told Eli as he was leaving. "You put yourself on the line for what was right. That takes courage." "I had help," Eli said, looking at Mary. "The best fights are never fought alone," Red Cloud agreed. As the tribal council vehicles finally pulled away, leaving Eli and Mary and the girls alone again, the cabin felt different. Not like a refuge from the world, but like a stronghold, a place worth defending, worth fighting for. Willow tugged on Eli's sleeve. "Did we win?" Eli knelt down to her level. "Today we did, and that's a start. What happens next? We keep fighting, but together." He looked up at Mary, at Sage standing proud beside her grandmother. "That's how it works, together." The sun was fully up now, bright on the snow, and the world looked clean and new. There would be more battles ahead, more struggles, more moments of doubt, but they'd faced the first test, and they'd held the line. That was something. That was everything. Spring came early that year, or maybe it just felt that way. The snow began its long retreat in March, revealing the brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. Eli stood on his porch, their porch, now watching Sage and Willow playing in the meadow below the cabin, their laughter carried on the wind. The federal case was still winding its way through the courts, but the injunction had held. Mountain Vista Development had pulled out of the area entirely, their investors spooked by the publicity and the legal complications. Other developers had backed off too, waiting to see how the treaty question would be resolved. The land was safe, at least for now. More than that, It had become a symbol. The story had spread across the state and beyond. The cowboy and the grandmother who'd stood against corporate pressure, the children who'd witnessed justice being done. People sent letters of support, small donations to help with legal fees, offers of help from historians and legal scholars. The cabin that had been Eli's lonely refuge had become a gathering place for people who believed that some things were worth fighting for. Thomas Red Cloud visited often, bringing updates on the legal proceedings and, more importantly, bringing friendship. The tribal council had voted to name Mary and Eli as honorary members, recognizing their role in bringing the treaty documents to light. It was a small thing, maybe, but it meant the world to Mary. It meant her granddaughters would grow up with a community, with roots, with a place that was theirs, not by legal deed, but by something deeper. The cabin itself had changed too. Eli had added a small addition over the winter, a second bedroom, properly built, with a real bed for Mary and bunks for the girls. They'd talked about it long into several nights, this question of permanence, of making the arrangement official. In the end, it was Willow who'd settled it. "Why can't we just stay forever?" she'd asked, with the simple logic of childhood. "We like it here. You like having us here. So why can't we stay? Why not, indeed?" So they'd stayed, and winter had turned to spring, and the space that had felt too small for 4 people now felt exactly right. Mary was in the kitchen now, teaching the girls how to make fry bread using her grandmother's recipe. The smell filled the cabin, warm and rich. Eli could hear them talking and laughing, could hear Mary's patient explanations and Sage's careful questions and Willow's delighted exclamations when she got something right. His mother's Bible was on the table now, not the mantel. Mary read from it sometimes in the evenings, and Eli found himself listening. The words didn't hurt the way they once had. They weren't promises that had been broken. They were just wisdom, offered without demand, there for whoever needed them. Sarah's photograph sat on the mantel now, alongside a picture of Mary's daughter. 2 women who'd been taken too soon, but whose love had shaped the people they'd left behind. Eli could look at Sarah's face now, without feeling that crushing weight of loss. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it had transformed into something gentler, a sweet ache instead of an open wound. The carved wooden box sat on the shelf, still open, still holding its small treasures. But Willow had added to it a smooth river stone she'd found, a piece of bark with an interesting pattern, a drawing she'd made of the 4 of them standing in front of the cabin. Small things, but they represented something important. The past, making room for the present. Grief, making room for new joy. A truck was coming up the trail, and Eli recognized it, his neighbor, from 5 miles down the mountain, coming for the community meeting they'd organized. Over the past months, they'd been bringing together everyone in the area who cared about protecting the land, making plans, sharing resources, building networks of support. No one person could fight alone, they'd learned, but together they were formidable. Inside, Mary was plating up the fry bread, golden and perfect. The girls carried plates to the table with careful concentration. This was their home now, these were their rhythms, and Eli felt grateful for every moment of it. "Company's coming," he called through the open door. "Good," Mary said. "I made plenty." Over the next hour, the cabin filled with neighbors and friends, ranchers and tribal members, old-timers, who remembered when the land was different, young families who wanted to protect it for their children. They talked about water rights and conservation easements, about legal strategies and community organizing. But more than that, they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the spring planting, whose kids were graduating, who needed help with fence repair. This was what community looked like, Eli realized. Not perfect people without conflict, but imperfect people choosing to show up for each other anyway. As the sun set and people began to leave, promising to return for next month's meeting, Eli found himself alone on the porch with Mary. The girls were inside, getting ready for bed, their voices a comfortable background hum. "You ever think about how different everything is?" Mary asked. From that first night in the storm? All the time, Eli admitted. I was so sure I had everything figured out. Stay alone, stay safe, never risk anything. Turns out I was just half alive. And now I'm fully alive. Scared sometimes, uncertain often, but alive. He looked at her, this woman who'd knocked on his door during a blizzard and changed everything. Thank you for that. Thank you for opening the door. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Inside, Willow called out that she couldn't find her carved bird, and Sage's patient voice explained where it was. Mary smiled at the sound. They're happy, she said. So am I, Eli replied, and knew it was true. Happy in a way he'd thought was lost to him forever. Happy not because life was perfect or simple or easy, but because it was full of purpose and connection, and the kind of meaning that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. The mountains stood dark against the sky, eternal and unchanged, but the people living in their shadow had been changed by storm and struggle, and the simple choice to stand together when it would have been easier to stand apart. Eli Thatcher had spent 20 years in isolation, convinced that solitude was safety. It had taken 3 strangers in a snowstorm to teach him otherwise. It had taken an old woman's dignity and 2 small girls' trust to show him that life was for living, not just enduring. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. Spring was here, bringing with it the promise of things to come. There would be challenges ahead, there always were. But they'd face them together, this makeshift family that had found each other in the wilderness. Inside the cabin, Mary was tucking the girls into bed, her voice soft with a lullaby. Eli didn't recognize, but found beautiful anyway. He stood and went to join them, closing the door gently against the night, sealing in the warmth and the light and the love that had somehow bloomed in the unlikeliest of places. Home, he thought. This is what home feels like. And for the first time in 20 years, Eli Thatcher was exactly where he was meant to be.